Three-time Grammy Award-winning R&B singer R. Kelly is facing decades in prison after he was convicted of racketeering and sex trafficking on September 27th in a courtroom in Brooklyn, New York. Testimony from several Black women gave insights into the 30-year reign of terror that R. Kelly exacted on women over his more than 2 decade singing career. The journey to hold R. Kelly accountable began in 1991 and involved testimony from more than 4 dozen witnesses, graphic videotape, and salacious audio recordings. With all of this evidence, why did it take so long? And what does his conviction mean for sexual assault cases involving women of all races, but particularly Black victims, whose stories are often overlooked and marginalized? We have answers, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
In 2017, Kenyette Barnes and Orenike Odeli organized a movement called Mute R. Kelly. These two women wanted people to stop claiming that they could separate the man from his music. They wanted to provide a global platform for survivors, activists, and those who have been silenced for decades. They wanted those women to feel seen and heard. More importantly, Barnes and Odeli wanted to change the narrative for Black women and girls. They wanted to tell these women and girls that they are credible victims of sexual violence and that they are to be believed, protected, and supported. Kelly still has several cases pending, including a federal child pornography and obstruction case in Illinois and a state prostitution case in Minnesota. Here for my leadoff panel is famed women's rights attorney Gloria Allred. She was in the Brooklyn courtroom on most days of the trial and is representing 3 of the victims in civil suits against R. Kelly. Good morning, and thank you so much, Gloria, for joining me. Always
Good morning.
a pleasure. You are such an inspiration, and your presence at this trial, I'm sure, meant so much to not just your clients, but to women, all over this country that have been watching very closely what was going to happen here. I just want to ask you, you were quoted, I read in a couple of articles, that you said R. Kelly is the worst of all predators that you have pursued in your long and illustrious career.
Right.
What makes him the worst?
In the 47 years I've been practicing law, he is the worst predator that I have come into contact with for many reasons, Areva. One is that he took advantage of underage girls as well as adult women. And many women of color, by the way, not only African-American women who've been very important in all of this, but I also, in addition to representing the African-American women who were victims, also represented Latina women who were brave enough to testify. And in addition to the 3 victims for whom charges were filed, I also represented several other witnesses, some of whom were victims. And I have not filed civil lawsuits for them, but I did represent them in the criminal case. Back to your question about the worst, he also used his business empire to enable him and to support him. That is why racketeering charges were filed against him. That made him also more powerful and more dangerous than the sexual predator who does not have the assistance of a business empire to recruit girls, to help him to isolate them, to intimidate them, to indoctrinate them, as R. Kelly did. Further, R. Kelly knew that he had genital herpes, which is a sexually transmitted disease. And because he knew it, he should have disclosed it to his victims, but he did not do that. He failed to disclose it. And as a result, some of the underage girls, for example, contracted genital herpes, and they're going to have to deal with that harm and the damage that it's done to them for the rest of their lives. And, finally, this is a man who he attempted to control these women and used many of these underage women in sex videos, which are really child pornography. And in those child pornography videos, he directed them, he produced them, he humiliated them, he shamed them, he forced them to say humiliating, degrading things about themselves, and he directed them into sexual positions. And further, he used those child pornography tapes to kind of hold them over their head and suggest to some of them that if they ever said anything about what he did to them and with them, that he would release these humiliating tapes and pictures of them. And in fact, as to one of my clients, he did release naked photos of her in retaliation for her speaking out. So this is a combination of all of these things is what makes him, as far as I'm concerned, the worst sexual predator that I have ever encountered. And he did it with so many others, not only with those who were brave enough to testify at the trial, but to many others who would have testified but were not called to testify for many legal reasons, or who were just even afraid to contact authorities.
And you were in the courtroom most days during the trial, Gloria. What was that like? You've heard this testimony before. You've been a part of other high-profile cases involving sexual assault. But what was it like sitting inside of that Brooklyn courtroom, hearing these women have to recount their stories of this horrific conduct that you just laid out?
Yeah, I was in the courtroom because I represented the victims or witnesses who were testifying. And so the court allowed me in. Most others, including the press, were not allowed into the actual courtroom because of COVID. It was very emotional for my clients, but they conducted themselves with grace and with dignity. It was apparently very upsetting to the defense attorney that I was there, and he commented on that a number of times. And at a certain point, the defense was called up to the sidebar to speak to the judge, who my sense of it was that, she didn't take kindly to his commenting about and was making insinuations about witnesses having their own private attorney, which of course victims are entitled to have in a criminal case as well as a civil case. And he even mentioned me in his final argument. So I'm glad that it was disturbing to him. I was there to support my clients. They survived the cross-examination, which was intense in many instances, Areva, very, very well. They kept their cool. They knew their truth and they spoke their truth, despite whatever the defense tried to do to suggest that somehow their credibility was in doubt, which it wasn't.
Yeah, obviously I wasn't there like you, but I've read pretty much, every account that I could about what happened in that courtroom. And this lawyer used a strategy, that we haven't, seen in a lot of these high profile cases. And that was to go after these victims, to go after these witnesses. He really attacked them, basically called them gold diggers, called them opportunists. Were your clients prepared for that, that kind of personal attack?
I always say when someone is engaging in name calling, it's usually a sign of weakness that they don't have evidence, strong evidence to argue. My clients were totally prepared. They understood that all they had to do was tell the truth. They're not there to help anyone. They're not there to hurt anyone. They're just there to tell their truth. And then the jury will make the ultimate decision, which is what they did. So they were fine. Some broke down, others didn't. They get to tell it however they're going to tell it, as long as they're telling the truth. And I'm just really happy about the result. I'm mostly happy for them, because their courage was rewarded in that the jury did find that he was guilty. And as a result, he's going to face potentially years in prison. And as you pointed out, Areva, there are other prosecutions. There's a state prosecution. There's a federal prosecution in Illinois coming up next. There is a prosecution in Minnesota where I represent the victim there. This man is just in a world of hurt. And even if he appeals from this conviction, he's got other prosecutions awaiting him. And he's got a long road ahead. But the victims now are so happy. So many of them were crying afterwards. And, they didn't know what a jury will do. Nobody knows what a jury will do. Anybody who tries to guess what a jury will do obviously doesn't have experience with lawsuits or criminal cases. So they were just thrilled and very thankful to the jury and to the Homeland Security agents and the wonderful prosecutors, all women team of prosecutors, I might point out. And, they were so dedicated and cool. And we had a woman judge as well.
Yeah. How much do you think the Me Too movement has helped to get to where we are today, Gloria? Because we know in 2008, R. Kelly was acquitted on what some thought was pretty strong evidence presented in that child pornography trial. But yet, we see now a whole different result in 2021. Do you think that the Me Too movement played a big part in what we're seeing today?
Well, I mean, I've been practicing law for 47 years and bringing women out for 47 years and having their voice heard, women, minorities, everyone. So it didn't start with a hashtag on the internet, although I'm glad there is a hashtag on the internet. But to your point, there were some victims who were very demoralized by that verdict in Chicago, which was a state prosecution. There were a lot of reasons why he was acquitted. I won't go into them. But I felt that the Justice Department and the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, their federal prosecutors, they were the ones who could bring this up and bring this down and get a conviction. And so I had confidence in them. My clients knew that I had confidence that they were the ones that needed to be the first to prosecute this case. And so all I can say is I'm so thankful that my clients trusted me and trusted these federal agents and federal prosecutors. So much work went on behind the scenes. You can't imagine. They vetted the evidence. It wasn't just based on the testimony of the clients, although that was extremely important. There was a great deal of electronic evidence. There were emails, there were texts, there were business records, there were cell phone records, and many of the records, by the way, were even kept by R. Kelly in his warehouse. So a lot of his own, evidence was seized and used against him. Yeah, so all I can say is, there were more than 40 witnesses. And wow, what an incredible case. What a great job everyone did.
Yeah, R. Kelly didn't watch The Wire and obviously didn't take heed of the Stringer Bell rule about keeping records of a criminal enterprise. But final question for you, Gloria. This was one of the first cases, high-profile Me Too cases in the Me Too era, involving a Black defendant, R. Kelly, and women of color, predominantly African-American, some Latina women, as you identified. What do you think this means for minority women, Black and brown women in particular, who oftentimes feel like they have not been included in the Me Too movement and that their voices and their stories have not been centered and heard? Do you think this is a turning point for those women?
Well, I do think that they should know that they matter and that their testimony is valued and that what they say really can help not only themselves, but others. And I don't necessarily mean by speaking out publicly to the press. They should contact private attorneys. That's what these clients of mine did. I don't ever contact anyone. They reached out to me. And for any private attorney, whether it's me or anyone throughout the nation, they can have a confidential conversation and they can understand. And I always tell people who reach out to me the benefits and risks of their options. And their options include, a confidential settlement without a lawsuit, without speaking out publicly, or a civil lawsuit, which is public, or speaking to law enforcement in a criminal case, if that's what they want. A combination of those, just some of those. And they can think of the benefits and risks of each option. That's what I think that they should do. But I do think that minority women, especially, you're right, their voices have not been heard in the past, or if they've been heard, it's kind of in a fleeting moment. And essentially nothing happened except they were heard, and then there was no legal action. We need action. I'm not willing to just be kind of sit there and be a witness to history. I'm very action oriented, but I like, but again, it's up to the client. It's not for me or any private attorney to force anyone to do anything they don't want. They need to know and be informed about what they want to do, and then they can do it. So that's what this is all about. And I'm just so proud of them because they become empowered, and their empowerment has helped not only them, but also helped so many other minority women and other women who are not minority women to have courage. And courage is now being rewarded because justice has been done and it's long overdue. And as you pointed out, some people may have thought it's never going to come. I can't trust the system. I can't have confidence in it. But now they know they can.
Well, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Gloria. Always a pleasure to sit down with you. And thank you for the work that you do for the 47 years of standing up for women of all color, and helping, help with this case, bring the justice that so many women have been wanting and hoping for so long. So glad you were in that courtroom, and so glad you irritated the hell out of that lawyer.
I know. I'm honored by the fact that he was annoyed that I was there. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're powerful when you're irritating the defense attorney. So
we are women. Right. We are women. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, Areva. Bye-bye. Keep up the great work.
All right. Always a pleasure to sit down and talk with Gloria. I consider her a mentor as well as a friend, as well as her, amazing daughter, Lisa, who's my colleague. My next guest is Bernarda Villalona. She's a former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney. She's returning to the show, and I wanted to have Bernarda back because she's practiced law in Manhattan, in New York, where this trial took place. Good morning, Bernarda.
Good morning, Areva.
You've been vocal about this case. You've had some great pickups in some national news outlets. But let's start with the racketeering. When you think of racketeering charges, you're thinking of Tony Soprano. You're thinking of mob bosses and the mafia. You're not typically thinking of sexual predators like R. Kelly or, others that we've seen in the news, Weinstein, etc. But why were racketeering charges brought by this prosecutorial team?
Absolutely, Areva. It's true. When you think about racketeering, when you think about RICO, as it's normally called, you think about mafia cases, you think about gang cases, especially here in the Eastern District of New York, where R. Kelly was tried. The majority of their RICO cases have to deal with the local gangs here in New York City. So in regards to how they made this law-abiding, this music company, this music artist, this Grammy Award-winning artist, to consider him an enterprise, a criminal enterprise, that focused on the purpose of recruiting young ladies for illegally sexual conduct. What I think happened here, and what is the huge difference of how this federal case came about, is that because of that RICO charge, that one charge, guess what? You heard of decades of victims come in and testify about incidents that took place between them and R. Kelly, Jane Does as well as John Does. If RICO was not in the picture, Areva, there is no way that this federal court could have brought in so much female victims and male victims to come in and testify. Period. Because even when you're dealing with the Mann Act, you're dealing with one specific victim. Here, when they charged the Mann Act, they were talking about Jane Doe number 5 as well as Jane Doe number 6. It didn't have to deal with all of the other Jane Does that you heard in the Racketeering Act. I mean, look, when we look at it, what was the first count within the Racketeering Act? You're talking about 1994 bribery for bribing an official to get a fake identification in order for Aaliyah to be able to marry R. Kelly at the age of 15. So this is huge. It's definitely thinking outside of the box. And let's see how the other part of the country decides to take this RICO Act and prosecuting in the future.
I'm so glad you brought up Aaliyah. And for years, we have heard rumors that R. Kelly got a fake ID for Aaliyah and married her when she was 15 years old. But he was never charged specifically with sexual violence or sexual assault against Aaliyah. So in this racketeering charge that this case that just went forward, the Aaliyah case played in, was he charged for the fake ID, or was he charged for having, sex with a minor?
So in regards to Aaliyah herself, when you look at the racketeering charge, and there were 14 acts within the racketeering charge, and the government only had to prove 2 of those acts in order for R. Kelly to be found guilty. So the first act had to deal with Aaliyah herself. However, what R. Kelly was being charged with is bribery in regards to that first act. And that is that he directly or indirectly caused another individual, that being Demetrius Smith, who was actually a manager, who came in and testified and was given immunity to testify, and testified that he bribed a public official in order to make an identification card that allowed for Aaliyah to get married and appear to be of the age of 18. But it is not for having any sexual relations with Aaliyah. However, Areva, during the trial, you heard testimony. You heard testimony about how R. Kelly was having oral sex with Aaliyah, how one of the Jane Does, or actually one of the non-charged Jane Does, walked in on them having oral sex. So you did hear a lot about Aaliyah. However, it's not a charge related to a sexual count, but more of bribery having to deal with the racketeering count.
That, you said that they were thinking outside the box. I'm sitting here thinking from a legal standpoint, this is like one of those cases that there should be in crim law and taught to students, because it's really incredibly brilliant for these prosecutors to reach back to that act. And like you said, not charge the statutory rape, which is what it was when you have sex with a minor, but the bribery to get the identification card then becomes the act that is charged under RICO. And the records, Gloria talked about, it wasn't just the riveting testimony from the witnesses and the victims, but it was emails, text messages, business records. And, I made that reference to Stringer Bell, the Alba character in The Wire, who, smacks one of his lackeys around and says, "Fool, don't keep records. This is a crime we're engaged in." So do you think the folks in R. Kelly's world had any idea that as they were memorializing their criminal conduct, that they would find themselves, being held accountable and having their own records being used as evidence for their conviction, for R. Kelly's conviction?
So, Areva, think about it. R. Kelly has gotten away for years, for decades, since the 90s. In R. Kelly's mind, I don't think he ever thought that he would be held accountable for any of his sexual interactions with any of these females. You got to think, we're dating back to 1994. Now, it is public record. R. Kelly did marry Aaliyah. There's a certificate, a marriage certificate. All of that is documented, and he was not charged for that. All these years, 2008, he goes to trial and he is acquitted. So I think in the mind of R. Kelly, the king of R&B, the Pied Piper, as he calls himself, he did not think that he will ever be held accountable. And also, let's just take it to a step further. The majority of the document evidence that was used by the prosecution is R. Kelly making these alleged victims now, write letters that are incriminating against themselves so he could use it in the future. So if there were to be any kind of civil lawsuit or criminal case. However, the prosecution in this case flipped it and said, look at this common theme. All of these victims, these witnesses were forced to write letters that are incriminating. And all these women that did come in and testify, and the John Does, said R. Kelly made me write that letter. That did not happen. So that was used against R. Kelly. It was recovered from his storage facility because he was holding on tight to those documents, those letters, to see if he could use it in the future. And instead, it backfired on him.
Give us an example, Bernarda, of like what some of these letters said. Like, what were these victims, forced to write?
So at least one of the witnesses who testified, who worked as an assistant or a manager, she was forced to write that she stole some items from R. Kelly, that R. Kelly does no wrong. I stole some items and I apologize for it. So that way it can be used against him. Also, there was another letter from a John Doe, and John Doe who testified, who actually was given a cooperation agreement because he supposedly bribed one of the witnesses in this case. Now, that John Doe also wrote a letter and was like, look, R. Kelly did nothing wrong. I'm the one in the wrong. Everything was consensual. Same thing with Jane Doe number 5, who was part of the Mann Act counts. She also wrote a letter to her brother, and that's actually what the jury requested during the deliberations. They wanted to see that letter. In that letter, she says that she is there voluntarily, that R. Kelly is not doing any wrong to her, that she is happy where she's at. So again, you have all these different types of letters. So if something were to happen in the future, it could benefit R. Kelly, but it backfired. But it was nice of the jury to be able to say, you know what, I want to see that letter, because that is exactly what the defense emphasized during their closing arguments, is that, look, these victims here, they enjoyed this life. They wanted the life of being with a star. Look at the letters that they wrote and how they communicated via text. This is what they wanted. They asked for it. And that backfired on the defense.
So we know, Bernarda, that there were a lot of immunity agreements given to some of the folks in his circle in order to get them to testify. Immunity being, if you come forward and testify, we won't charge you. That's what immunity agreements are. And that's how federal prosecutors often make their cases. They get people close to the target and they get them to flip or they get them to testify, and then they let them go free. But so many people are asking, this is an enterprise. What's going to happen? And people want to see those managers, those employees, those other people that were, participating in the sex trafficking and this conduct. They want to see them held accountable and brought to justice. Is it likely that we're going to see any prosecutions of anyone in his circle?
It's so sad, Areva, because we know that R. Kelly did not act alone throughout these years in engaging in sexual conduct with underage girls. We know that he was enabled by his inner circle. We know that he was also enabled by some of the parents of these young girls. R. Kelly did not act alone. However, you haven't seen anyone else charged in this case regarding any of these allegations. And what I believe, having been a former prosecutor, is that the government just does not have enough evidence to be able to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, not a civil case, but instead beyond a reasonable doubt inside of a criminal courtroom. That's why they haven't been charged. And I don't think that is going to happen. Because I'll tell you this, Areva, what they should have done, if they could have, is have charged those other individuals where there was criminal liability and then given a cooperation agreement or an immunity deal. And that way they would have testified against R. Kelly and made that case stronger, because you usually are going after the bigger person. So here R. Kelly is the kingpin. That's who they were going after. But one example of why an immunity agreement is important, Areva, there is no way that R. Kelly would have been found guilty of the first act within the racketeering statute of bribery without the testimony of Demetrius Smith. And remember, Demetrius Smith, who testified early on, had to be given an immunity agreement because he said he will not testify. And he had to admit that he did pay $500 to bribe an official to make an identification card for Aaliyah. However, during his testimony, he said that R. Kelly did not expressly ask him to do it and he wasn't aware of it. But of course, the jury did not find that to be the case.
So you're thinking that the reason we're not likely to see prosecutions of these other folks who were involved in this enterprise is that the prosecution doesn't have strong enough evidence that they can make a case beyond reasonable doubt if these individuals were charged and then eventually tried.
Absolutely. And Areva, not even that, but just also remember the statute of limitation has passed on many of these cases as well.
Yeah. Let's talk, Bernarda, about what's next for R. Kelly. We know he's going to be sentenced in that Brooklyn courtroom. We know he faces anywhere from 10 to 10 years to life. What do you think? Yes. I mean, having practiced in New York, having been a former prosecutor, what do you think is the likely sentence that this judge gives him?
So in regards to Judge Donnelly, and Judge Donnelly is the judge who presided over the trial. She used to be a prosecutor for 25 years here in New York and was also a judge in state court. So she is very familiar with sex abuse cases because she was also a supervisor when she was at the DA's office in one of those units. I see Judge Donnelly given at the very least 20 or 30 years to R. Kelly in this case. Because remember, you're dealing with multiple Jane Does. And because there are multiple Jane Does, R. Kelly is subjected to consecutive time on these counts as well. So it's not like she'll give one bulk sentence and just run it concurrent, because there's no reason to run it concurrent here. He took it to trial, and we're talking about several acts that took place through decades. I think also why the sentence is scheduled for May of 2022, because usually a federal sentencing takes place within a month or 2 months, unless there's a reason to delay it. I think what the judge is allowing the defense to do is come up with a resolution in the two cases he has in Illinois, as well as the case in Minnesota, to see if maybe they can work out a package deal where it'll be one sentence to probably cover all of the cases that he's facing. But I highly doubt it, because there's no incentive in terms of, look, R. Kelly, the age that he is, he's going to die in jail.
Yeah, he's in his mid 50s. And if you're talking 20 to 30 years, we're talking about a man 70 to 80 years old. And that's just in the case in Brooklyn, and not to mention, as you said, those two in Illinois and one in Minnesota. And I heard or I read something that his lawyer said they kind of thinking about appeal. In my mind, I was reading, okay, probably run out of money, knows that there's not many grounds that would lead to a successful appeal. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see some headlines about a change in his attorneys moving forward. But assuming that he is not extradited and taken to trial in those other jurisdictions, he stays in federal. Is he in federal prison now in Illinois?
He is.
Okay. So
No, he's in federal housing facility here in Brooklyn at the Metropolitan Detention Center. So he is being held there. Normally you stay there until sentencing. However, because he's facing counts in Illinois as well as in Minnesota, it is possible that in Illinois they can actually transfer R. Kelly to Illinois so he can start appearing for his court appearances there, and that at the time of the sentencing in May that he's transferred back to Brooklyn just so he can be sentenced. But one thing, Areva, remember that when you're dealing with a federal case, just because you were tried in Brooklyn in the Eastern District of New York, that doesn't mean that that's where you're going to serve your sentence. Like in state court, you stay in the state that you're sentenced in. He could be handling his sentence anywhere in the country, which I think will probably be in Colorado, because it's the maximum security jail that exists prison for the federal system.
Well, lots to continue to follow. Bernarda, thank you so much for your insights and helping us understand the complex case that was made against R. Kelly. So many women, this is music to their ears. He's finally been held accountable, and as you said, not likely to ever see the outside of a jail cell, whether it's because of this case or the other three pending cases. My friend, again, always good to see you, and thanks so much for helping us unpack the R. Kelly convictions. All right.
Thank you, Areva.
My next guests are Dr. Lashawnda Lindsay. She's a research scientist who leads the Black Girls in STEM Education Research Initiative at Wellesley College. And joining her is Dr. Linda Williams. She is the director of the Justice and Gender-Based Violence Research Initiative at Wellesley College. You can't really talk about the R. Kelly conviction without talking about what this means for Black girls and Black women who often have been left out of conversations about sexual violence. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Lindsay and Dr. Williams.
Good morning.
I want to start with you, Dr. Lindsay. The conviction of R. Kelly, as I talked about with Gloria Allred in the first segment, is really the first high-profile prosecution in the Me Too era in which the victims were Black and brown women. How important do you think that is, to this overall Me Too movement and our understanding about sexual violence in this country?
Okay. Well, it's monumental in terms of this is probably one of the first documented cases, high-profile cases in which Black women and girls have received justice, because historically Black women's bodies have been commodified and used in sexually violent ways. And so it's a huge win for our community, because finally the American justice system, because given that this is a federal case, is finally standing up and attempting to protect Black women and girls.
And Dr. Williams, you and Dr. Lindsay wrote an article about sexual violence and race, and it's entitled Me Too, Sexual Violence, Race, and Black Girls Matter. And in that article, you say that there's a direct correlation between the race of victims of sexual assault and rape and whether the perpetrator will ever be prosecuted. Do you think that's starting to change, or is that research still the state of where we are with prosecutions today?
Well, hopefully we're seeing a change in that regard, and it's a long time coming. You have to remember that when the death penalty was found to be cruel and unusual punishment, the disproportionate application of the death penalty was when the victims were white, not when the victims were Black. So we have a long legacy of really not paying attention to crimes against Black women. primarily. And so all of the efforts that were brought to this, and fantastic case and all the time spent, does mean that, maybe we're turning the corner a bit, but it's still a ways to go. And work of everyone here and the whole community, and particularly the book by, Tarana Burke, really starting to say, look, we have to have a dramatic cultural shift. One thing I wanted to say, hearing about all the R. Kelly case, is that, Kate, that I've talked with many victims over the years, and victims of trafficking, sex trafficking, who have told very similar stories. When I heard one of the victims interviewed recently, and I applaud her and the work and the hard work it was to testify. She said something about how R. Kelly trained them ahead of time, like how to talk on interviews, how to respond. And it just rang a bell, because so many of victims of trafficking I've spoken to talk about how the pimp, the purveyor, the RICO leader, does training with them. One victim said to me, he takes out a whiteboard and writes down, this is what you do if the police stop you. So in any event, there's a lot of cases like this, and hopefully the Me Too movement is going to help bring them out and bring the resources needed to respond to them.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Williams, because that was a big part of what we heard, or what we've been able to read about the testimony, is the grooming process and the strict rules that R. Kelly had. Some of the witnesses talked about what they were allowed to wear and not wear, how they had to address him. They had to call him daddy and other names that they had to use. They were cut off from their families. They weren't allowed to talk to families or friends. He told them what they could eat, when they had to go to bed. I mean, he really controlled every aspect of their lives. And some of the women were initially even favorable towards him, and later realized that this was a form of mind control. We know, Dr. Lindsay, that the documentary Surviving R. Kelly, we know that the Mute R. Kelly movement, that both of those cultural events played a big role in causing prosecutors to take a look at his case and at the charges that have been made against him. And something interesting that was said in that documentary by Mickey Kendall, she's a cultural critic. She said at the height of the R. Kelly breakout, when he was just becoming this big, super R&B star in the 1990s, she said he would hang out at a Chicago McDonald's and would prey on young girls from a nearby high school. And she said pretty much everybody knew it, but no one did anything. And she said it was because the girls are Black. How significant is the race of victims in, what's playing out here? Because what the girls what Mickey Kendall makes clear is that this wouldn't be a 30-year prosecution had these girls been white.
Right. That's actually correct. Because in the sense that if you think about R. Kelly, and, I was of the age, Aaliyah's age when these things were happening. And I can remember the stories that I've heard, the experiences, like I could have been a victim. You could have been a victim, because we were of that right age when he was actually preying on young women. And he was hiding in plain sight. He calls himself the Pied Piper. If you know anything about the urban legend of the Pied Piper uses music to lure out individuals to follow him. And it's a delusional way to kind of get people to be and to follow his lead. And he's used that throughout his music, throughout his influence in the community. And so the historical context, it goes well beyond R. Kelly. He is the contemporary manifestation of the long history of the commodification and devalue of Black women and girls. And so what his case really means for me is that is raising up our voices and being able to say that there is time out. We have to protect our daughters. We have to protect our nieces. We have to protect our friends and from these predators, no matter who they are.
And you mentioned that, R. Kelly was hiding in plain sight or plain view. The videotape that was the subject of his 2008 trial, that videotape where one of his associates came forward and said that he was actually urinating on her niece and engaged in sexual conduct with a minor. That witness who came forward wasn't believed. That he was acquitted, but that tape circulated throughout the Black community all over the country, not just Chicago. And many African Americans, and maybe others too, watched that tape, but yet continued. That was during that era, as that tape is circulating, as these rumors are circulating. He reached the highest height in terms of the music career, winning Grammy Awards and winning awards and selling out concerts. Why do you think people were so quick to just dismiss, kind of the vile conduct that he was involved in that was pretty obvious and known to so many people?
One of the reasons is that he was a key figure in the R&B music industry at that time, right? And he had a lot of power and control. And so many people, again, lured by his music, right? He told us what was happening in his music. If you think of 12 Play, remember the song 12 Play, where he outlined steps of sexual intercourse. So if he was writing that song for an adult woman, would he have to say first you do this, second you do this? He goes through all the 12 steps. So I think people in the community were so enthralled with the music, so enthralled with the beats, even singing the words, but not even realizing what we were ingesting. Like he was feeding the community messages about what was happening, and he was hiding in plain sight. So it goes back to this idea that he's a figure, he's making all this wonderful music, but not really realizing, holding him accountable for his behavior and what he was doing to so many young girls and young women throughout the community.
Yeah, and Dr. Williams, we had a chance. We didn't hear from R. Kelly during this 6-week trial, but we did hear from R. Kelly when he gave an interview to Gayle King. If you remember that explosive interview where he kept getting up and she kept, using his full name, Robert, to try to gain control over him, to get him to sit down, to get him to answer the questions. He was tearful. He was emotional. He was in denial. He kept saying that, he didn't do these things. What's your sense about that? You've worked with a lot of victims. You've worked with a lot of perpetrators. What are you to make of what we saw in that Gayle King interview versus what we now know was the evidence presented in this Brooklyn trial?
Right. Well, he was using the tactics that, can you imagine if they're used against a young girl, a young woman who, is unsure of herself. And luckily, Gayle King was not going to be taken in by that. But as I saw that happen, I was thinking, what if you were one of the victims and he started acting like that? And so that's really part of the whole display of the power and control and different ways of attempting to win over this person and to win over the audience. It really didn't work. But when a young woman is in need of that kind of attention, is sort of in awe of his power, and the Pied Piper, he was trying to do it, and that's what I saw there anyway, and
so
realized
you saw a lot
what
of
it would be.
theatrics and drama, and you thought that there was, you weren't convinced for 1 minute that what we were hearing was the truth?
Not at all, no. I mean, but I think it's pretty clear when you hear the victims tell their stories that these are the kinds of ways that he behaved towards them. And in fact, I think the young woman interviewed recently by Gayle King said, he came out of that interview thinking that he did really well and had told us how to respond. And we went and had food. It was probably McDonald's, as Dr. Lindsay mentions, because, even though, the people who control women like this will try to give favors and small things. I mean, sometimes it's diamonds and sometimes it's not. But in any event, he just
so he left that
to be
interview
like a pro.
delusionally thinking he had done a good job, so good of a job that he's now going to teach these women how they too can give an interview. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Dr. Lindsay, a lot of articles written by some of the victims. Victims have come forward, as Dr. Williams have said, and given interviews. Some of the women involved, like Dream Hampton, involved with the surviving R. Kelly. We've heard from them, and a lot of women are saying it's bittersweet. They're saying it's bittersweet, glad that he's convicted, glad that he's facing 10 to life, glad that he has these 3 other charges pending against him, but they're saying it took too long. And they said too much damage has been done. What would you say to those women, Dr. Lindsay?
I would encourage the women to go on their own process of healing, right? In terms of to making sure that they're going through counseling and doing the work that they need to do to heal from the process, right? Because now he has been held accountable. It took far too long for him to be held accountable. And so, but they played a huge role in that happening. And they're not only changing their lives, but they're changing the dynamics in which and how Black women and girls are perceived, and how men need to be held accountable for sexual abuse and sexual assault. And it also debunks this notion that Black girls, they want this type of behavior, this idea that they're adultified, right? Where even with the case with the niece of another singer, a lot of people didn't believe it because she was too grown, or she was too this idea that they were willing participants in these sexual relationships with an adult man. And so debunking those myths, those cultural myths, is a huge feat, and which should be celebrated. But they also have to kind of give themselves the opportunity and the space to heal from the trauma that they've experienced, not only once, but over and over again.
I'm running out of time, Dr. Lindsay, but quickly talk to your Black people, your community, us, who are still holding on to this notion that R. Kelly's been railroaded, that this is a conspiracy against Black men, that, this is the white man bringing a Black man down. Talk to your people for me, please.
Well, yes, because this whole idea that he's innocent, he's clearly guilty, right? He is guilty as sin, right? So let's be clear about that. But the Black people, we have an interesting, I would say a violent relationship with the criminal justice system, right? Where there's this fear, like if I say something, then what's the ramifications for my uncle, for my brother, will he not only be held accountable? Because sometimes being arrested for a criminal offense could result in death. So something this serious but we have to kind of move away from that ideology and to use the system in ways that can benefit us. And we need more lawyers and more attorneys like yourself who can rise up and fight for and protect our rights as women and girls, and call a thing, And it goes back to that idea of airing our dirty laundry. Some laundry needs to be aired. We can't keep holding this in, and we have to hold people accountable for their bad behavior. And R. Kelly is finally being held accountable for his bad behavior. And we as a community have to accept that and heal from that.
Thank you. So well put in helping people understand that you can be against the disproportionate bias and abuse in our criminal justice system towards Black people and still be for that system holding Black, white, whatever color criminals accountable. And you can make that distinction. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, Black people, okay? So, all right, Dr. Lindsay and Dr. Williams, thanks so much for joining me this morning. Super, just happy to have you and have your voices on this issue. Really, really important. Again, thanks so much. All right, my next guest. We're going to talk to a man. We've been talking to all women this morning about R. Kelly. I wanted to bring on a man because, R. Kelly's a man, and so many of these people, particularly in the Black community, that are having a hard time with this conviction are men. My next guest is the Masculinity and Black Mental Health Training Manager for BEAM, and BEAM stands for Black Emotional and Mental Health, And so I want to welcome to the show Leroy Mitchell. Leroy, thank you so much for joining us. You've been listening, again, to women talk about what's happening with R. Kelly. And the reality is that even after the conviction, You can easily access R. Kelly's music on Apple Music, Amazon, YouTube. Now, Spotify did remove his music from their official playlist in 2018, but it's still, that music is available on the Spotify app. And some of these data streaming platforms say, hey, it's not our job to remove this music or make it unavailable. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me on the show today. I've learned a lot, and I just so appreciate everything that everyone has said on this call this morning. And what I would say to that is, when we talk about how do we create a community of safety in our programs, we talk about how do we center the needs of survivors of harm. And so what I have to say to that is we need to be asking the people, the ones who have been harmed by R. Kelly, what is it that they need to feel safe? What is it that they need to heal? And what boundaries do we need to set up as a collective community in order for them to get what it is that they need? And so, if that means not playing R. Kelly's music, then I think we really need to take the lead of those who have experienced harm by R. Kelly in making those decisions.
So we know, Leroy, that the trial attracted a large audience online, predominantly Black audience. People were watching like every day of the trial, everything that happened in the trial. There were people on YouTube who were actually doing little, talk shows, bringing on guests who had information about the trial. I mean, it really was a big thing on the internet. And what you saw were a lot of fights. People who were defending him against people who were, attacking him. And a lot of the men in this online community that kind of erupted over this trial, a lot of them were men who, again, were defending R. Kelly. Can you, help us with some insights into why are Black men in particular? Let's, put aside when they were just allegations. Now now we got criminal convictions. It's no longer just allegations. We got a
Right.
jury that has said on 9 counts of very serious sex trafficking, sexual assault charges, you are guilty. Why do you think so many men are still having a hard time with it?
Yeah. I believe that, if I were to, as a man, acknowledge, the harm that R. Kelly has done, I think that means that I have to acknowledge and really examine the ways in which I myself may have harmed others, the ways in which I myself might have been contributing to the lack of safety and harming folks in my community. And I might have to do the work and really examine the ways in which I myself have been harmed. And I myself may have been, may have experienced, sexual harm. And so I think the avoidance, the gaslighting, the minimization, that comes from that avoidance to really deal with some of those issues and the prevalence of sexual violence in our Black communities. And so rather than take accountability, rather than really lean in and center the experience of survivors, oftentimes Black men in particular will deflect, will avoid, so that we don't have to do that work.
What can we do to change that, Leroy? It's troublesome to Black women that we're asked to stand in solidarity. We organize the marches. When we talk about police brutality, mostly the high profile cases are Black men, even though Black women are killed by police as well. But it is the women, Black women, who are on the front lines, marching, organizing, protesting, calling for justice, doing the work to support Black men. So, our cred is there. There's no question about how we ride for Black men. But why aren't Black men? How do we get, well, you already told us why, but how do we get Black men to reciprocate, to understand on this issue, on the issue of sexual violence, where Black women are disproportionately the victims of sexual violence, that we need Black men standing up for Black women in the same way that we stand up on issues of mass incarceration and police violence for Black men?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I want to acknowledge all the work, the emotional labor, all the effort, that it takes, and that Black women and Black femme folks, do to support our communities. And so I just want to acknowledge that. And it's really up to us as men and masculine folks to take that emotional labor on, and do our own work. In our Black Masculinity Reimagined immersion programs, oftentimes there's, as a man saying, oh, I want to protect, I'm the protector of my family, I'm community. Well, protection means doing our own work. It's not just physical protection, it's emotional protection. It's me understanding how cycles of violence are present in my community. It's understanding how I may be and am continuing that violence. It's me being able to understand my emotions, to heal from my own, from the things that I have been harmed with. It's centering the experiences of women and femme folks. It's not minimizing, but rather validating and holding space and saying that, yes, as a masculine person, I have privilege and I want to be held accountable to the things and the ways in which I may have shown up, and do the work to build accountable and safe communities.
We saw one Black man, Bill Cosby spokesperson. Andrew Wyatt is out there frequently talking a lot, not saying much, but he does talk a lot. He gets a lot of media attention because he represents Bill Cosby. And Bill Cosby said, "Oh, R. Kelly was railroaded." How does that impede the work that you just described needs to be done when we have someone like Andrew Wyatt and Bill Cosby, who, for better or worse, do have a platform, and whether it's TMZ or network news, they're gonna report what they say. How harmful are those messages?
Yeah, Kimberly Crenshaw just released an essay on New York Times that really broke down the intersections of race and misogyny. And as Black men, we think, oh, I am oppressed by these systems. I am oppressed by the carceral system, and therefore I cannot be harmful to others. Well, yes, I may be a Black person, and I may be oppressed by these other systems, but I also do still have privilege of being a man, and being a cisgender man. And so that does not absolve me from creating harm and causing harm to others. And I think it's very important that, we really hold our Black men accountable and saying, yes, you produce great music. Yes, you may be a mentor to other people. And at the same time, that does not absolve you from taking accountability. And that does not mean that you cannot harm others. Really humanizing and really seeing Black men for who they are is holding them accountable and expecting more of them, and saying, you're more than the money you make, you're more than your prestige. We need you to do your part in creating safety and holding yourself accountable. That's the work right there. And that's how we really humanize Black men and masculine folks, by holding them to a higher standard.
Well, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Leroy, for your insight. Thank you for the work that you're doing around Black mental health, around male issues, masculinity issues, and thanks for mentioning that article by Kimberly Crenshaw.
Yes.
I think I'll use the word bittersweet that was used by some of the women who talked about the verdict in R. Kelly, and it is bittersweet. Sweet because finally justice, we saw justice for these victims. We saw the voices of Black women being centered in this conversation around sexual violence. We have men like Leroy who are standing up and saying that Black men need to be reflective. They need to look at the role that they play. They need to hold themselves accountable, and they need to definitely be stronger allies to Black women who have experienced sexual violence. So that's the sweet part. The bitter part is obviously this has taken too long. The voices of Black women have been marginalized for far too long. It took a documentary, not just a documentary, but an award winning blockbuster documentary that millions of people viewed. It took a hashtag Mute R. Kelly to go viral. It took, the voices of women for decades, not a year, not a month, not 5 years, but decades, in order to get to this point where R. Kelly was prosecuted. And we can't let it be another 30 years before a Black male predator or a predator of any color that preys on Black girls and women is brought to justice. So as much as we want to applaud the verdict, we also have to remember that justice for Black women and girls in this country is still not equal. It's still not justice in many ways. It's delayed, and there's absolutely no reason for that. Black girls and women should be believed. Their stories should be highlighted in the same way that those are of white women. And, we talk a lot about that. We just did a whole show on missing white women syndrome and how even missing white women are treated differently in this system than missing women of color. So we got a lot of work to do, people. Yes, we have a lot of work to do. And I'm not exempting the Black community because we too, and that's why I asked those questions of Leroy and Dr. Lindsay, because I wanted them to speak to Black people as well, because we have played a part in holding R. Kelly up, buying his music, supporting him, arguing, for him. And there's some reasons why, but when you know better, you have to do better. And so these experts are telling you why your arguments about the system just don't hold up in these cases. Yes, we know there's violence against Black men in the criminal justice system. Yes, we know there's a bias in the criminal justice system against Black men. But when Black men commit crimes like R. Kelly, we have to be willing and able to hold them accountable. So we can fight to dismantle the structural racism in the system, and we can fight to make the system more fair and equitable. And at the same time, we can hold predators like R. Kelly accountable. Quick words to live by before I get out. Step in the Name of Love ain't the only wedding or party song. Yes, I said it. Step in the Name of Love ain't the only song that we can listen to at a party or a wedding. We can get our electric slide on and our, Cupid shuffle on different songs. And the conviction of R. Kelly has helped fill in a frustrating gap in the Me Too movement. For many Black women, there was an absence of the Black female perspective and how Black women are disproportionately harmed. The case and trial and the widespread attention that the R. Kelly case has gotten, is not all encompassing. It's an important step, but it's not taking us. It hasn't taken us where we need to go. It's just a step. It's a step in holding predators accountable and centering Black women and girls. But let's not lose this moment. Let's not lose this moment by continuing to support his music, to support his works, to support his artistry. We don't have to keep stepping in the name of love. There are lots of other songs that you can play at your wedding, reception, or party, songs that honor Black women, that honor Black victims, and that honor our journey. I'm safe. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we're all in this together.